If you are enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Marcus Blackwood, but most folks around here just call me Grizzly. I guess the name fits. I'm a big guy with a beard that's more gray than brown these days, and I've spent most of my 48 years out in the wild. I'm a ranger here at Blackwood State Forest, northern Minnesota. Been doing this for over 15 years now, living in a little cabin at the edge of the forest with no neighbors for miles. I like it that way. It's quiet mostly. I wasn't always alone. My wife, Sarah, used to live with me here. She loved the forest as much as I did. But cancer took her 2 years ago, and ever since, it's just been me, the trees, and the cold. Some days I don't mind it. Other days, well, the silence can be deafening. People say I'm good at my job because of my past. I was a combat medic in Vietnam, saw a lot of things I wish I hadn't. Sometimes those memories come creeping in at night, like shadows you can't shake. Maybe that's why I like being out here in the forest. It gives me something else to focus on. Blackwood Forest is beautiful, but it's also harsh and unforgiving. Winters here are brutal. Temperatures can drop to -30 dU4F, and the wind will cut through you like a knife. The forest is a maze of towering pine trees, jagged rocks, caves, and sinkholes that can swallow a man whole if he's not careful. But the most unsettling thing about this place isn't the cold or the terrain. It's the stories. The locals, especially the native elders, talk about the Long Walker, some kind of spirit or monster that roams the forest during the winter. They say it's a wendigo, a creature driven by hunger, cursed to wander the woods forever. Most folks think it's just a tale to scare kids, but every now and then, someone goes missing. And when you live out here long enough, you start to wonder if there might be something to those stories. Over the past 3 months, 5 hikers have gone missing in the forest. 5. I've logged every detail in my journal: names, dates, search, patterns, everything. But no clues, no bodies. Just gone. The state sent a rescue team last week, but even they didn't find a damn thing. The forest doesn't give up its secrets easily. Yesterday, I was out on patrol, checking some of the trails for any signs of the missing hikers. That's when I found it. The deer. The first thing I noticed about the deer was the way it was frozen. Animals die out here all the time, it's nature. But this wasn't natural. The deer's body was twisted, like it had tried to get away from something. Its front legs were bent backward, and its ribs stuck out like broken tree branches under the snow. The frost clung to its fur, but the part that stopped me in my tracks was its stomach. Half of it was gone, torn open. The insides were shredded like something had been eating it. But that wasn't the worst part. The meat was frozen solid, completely. A kill like this should have been fresh because the blood was still pooled under it. But whatever did this, it froze fast. Too fast. That doesn't happen. Not like this. I crouched down and inspected the ground around it. That's when I saw the tracks. At first glance, I thought they might belong to a deer, but something about them was off. They were too far apart. For one thing, like a giant had been walking on hooves. And here's the part that made my stomach turn. The tracks were bipedal. 2 feet, not 4. I stood up slowly and scanned the tree line. It was quiet. Too quiet. No wind in the trees, no rustling, not even the sound of an animal scurrying through the snow. Just me and that thing lying there. And the tracks. I followed them for a bit, keeping my rifle ready. They weaved between the trees in a strange, deliberate path, heading deeper into the forest. The farther I went, the colder it seemed to get. The type of cold that seeps into your bones, no matter how many layers you've got on. After about 15 minutes, the tracks stopped. Just stopped. No sign of a struggle, no blood, no nothing. Like whatever made them had just vanished into thin air. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it. That's when the wind picked up sharp and sudden. like it came out of nowhere, and my radio crackled. Shh! Ranger, Blackwood. I froze. My hand went to the radio clipped to my jacket. It wasn't tuned to any channel, just dead air. But I swear I heard something. A voice. Help me. It was faint, but it was there. A man's voice, weak and strained. Hello? I said into the radio. This is Ranger Blackwood. Who's there? Over. Nothing. Just static. I tried again. If you can hear me, give me your location. Over. The same faint voice came back, breaking through the static. This time, it sounded closer. Lost. It's watching me. Every hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My radio wasn't working right. It couldn't pick up signals this clearly out here. Not in this weather. Whatever was happening, it wasn't normal. I spun around, my eyes scanning the trees again. That's when I saw it. A shadow. Not a clear shape, but tall. Too tall to be a man. It moved quickly between the trees, so fast I barely caught it. I raised my rifle and called out, "Hey, who's there? Show yourself." Nothing. Just the wind whistling through the trees. I stood there for what felt like forever, my finger hovering over the trigger. Finally, I lowered my rifle and took a deep breath. I didn't see it again, but I knew it was still there, watching. I didn't like the feeling I had as I made my way back to the cabin. My gut told me to leave it alone, to let it stay out there in the dark where it belonged. But something told me this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the twisted deer, the tracks, that shadow moving between the trees. Something didn't add up. I was used to the strange and the unexplained out here, but this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't done with me yet. So, the next morning, I packed up my supplies, grabbed my Winchester, and went back out. I knew I should have reported what I saw, but what was I supposed to say? That a deer was frozen in a weird position and I saw a shadow? I'd sound crazy. And in my line of work, crazy gets you benched. The air was colder than usual that morning. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the frost crunched louder under my boots than it should have. I followed the same trail as the day before, back to where the deer had been. It was gone now. Something or someone had dragged it off during the night, leaving behind a thin trail of blood that disappeared a few yards into the trees. I kept moving, scanning the ground for more tracks, but the snow was pristine, untouched. Eventually, I came to a ridge overlooking the western side of the forest. That's when I saw it, an opening in the rocks, a cave I'd never noticed before. Now, I've been patrolling Blackwood Forest for years, and I know every trail, every crevice, and every sinkhole like the back of my hand. This cave wasn't supposed to be here. I climbed down the ridge carefully, my rifle slung over my shoulder, and approached the entrance. The mouth of the cave was dark and wide, like a gaping hole in the earth. It felt wrong just being near it, like the air inside was heavier somehow, colder. But something pushed me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or stupidity. Either way, I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint, but sharp, like rotting meat buried under snow. The deeper I went, the more my boots slipped on the uneven ground. The walls were damp, coated in patches of slick, dark moss. About 20 feet in, my flashlight caught something carved into the rock. I crouched down to get a better look. Symbols, dozens of them, scratched deep into the stone. Some looked like animals: deer, wolves, bears, but others. I couldn't tell what they were. Shapes with long limbs and twisted horns. I ran my fingers over the carvings, trying to make sense of them. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing taller than anything else, carved into the rock. Its body was thin, bony, and its head was crowned with massive antlers that curled outward like tree branches. Underneath it were more symbols, arranged in patterns I didn't recognize. But I didn't need to. I knew what I was looking at. The Long Walker. The stories flashed through my mind. The creature cursed to wander the forests. feeding on anything unlucky enough to cross its path. The elders always said it wasn't just a myth. And now, here it was, carved into stone that looked older than the forest itself. A sound broke my focus. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. But the deeper I listened, the clearer it became. Marcus. I spun around, my flashlight bouncing off the walls. It wasn't possible. Nobody knew I was out here. "Who's there?" I called, my voice echoing through the cave. No answer, just the sound of dripping water somewhere in the distance. I swung the flashlight back toward the carvings, searching for anything I might have missed. And that's when I heard it again. "Marcus, help me." It was the same voice as yesterday, the man from the radio. My stomach dropped. The sound didn't seem to come from one direction, it was everywhere, bouncing off the walls like it was inside my head. I swallowed hard and gripped my rifle. Something told me I needed to leave. I turned and retraced my steps back toward the entrance, every nerve in my body on edge. But just as I reached the mouth of the cave, I froze. There was blood in the snow. Not a lot, but enough to make my gut tighten. It was fresh, still red against the white. My flashlight beam followed it, leading out into the trees, and then I saw him. A man slumped against a tree about 30 yards away. His head hung low, and his clothes were torn to shreds. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Hey," I called out, "can you hear me?" He didn't move. As I got closer, I could see how pale he was. His skin was almost gray, and his lips were cracked and blue. He looked like he hadn't eaten in weeks. I knelt beside him and shook his shoulder gently. "Hey, buddy, stay with me. What happened?" His eyes opened, and I'll never forget what I saw. They were bloodshot, wide, and filled with terror. His voice was barely a whisper when he spoke. "It's watching." I don't know how long I knelt there, staring into the man's wild, bloodshot eyes, but every second felt heavy. He looked like a skeleton wrapped in thin skin, his muscles twitching under the surface, as if he couldn't sit still. "Hey, take it easy," I said, keeping my voice calm. I wasn't calm, though, not even close. "You're safe now. I'm going to get you some help." He shook his head violently, his body jerking like a puppet on strings. "No, no help. It's too late. It's..." His words trailed off, and his head slumped to his chest. For a second, I thought he was gone. Then he twitched again, pulling in a wheezing breath that sounded painful. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to keep him talking. "Thursday to Thursday Omas," he whispered, his voice so faint I had to lean closer to hear him. "Thomas Wheeler." The name hit me like a punch to the chest. He was one of the missing hikers. I'd seen his picture on the missing persons fleer, a young guy in his 20s, smiling and holding a backpack in the photo. This didn't look like the same person. "Thomas, what happened to you? Were you with the others?" His head snapped up so fast it made me jump. His eyes locked on mine, wide with terror. It walks like a man," he said. His voice cracked, and he started shaking, his teeth chattering even though he wasn't cold. "But it's not a man, it's..." He stopped mid-sentence, his whole body stiffening. "They're calling me," he muttered. "Do you hear them? They're calling me. Thomas, listen to me," I said firmly, gripping his shoulder. "Nobody's calling you. You're safe now. We're going to get out of here." But he wasn't listening. His gaze drifted past me into the trees. His body relaxed for a moment, and a faint, twisted smile crept over his face. "You can't run from it," he said. "It's always hungry, always watching." I didn't like where this was going. I grabbed him under the arms and hoisted him to his feet. He was lighter than he should have been, like his body had been hollowed out. "We're leaving," I said, more for my own benefit than his. He didn't respond, but he didn't fight me either. I half carried, half dragged him back to my cabin. By the time we got back, the sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the forest in long shadows. I set Thomas down in the chair by the fireplace. He stared blankly at the flames, his lips moving silently like he was talking to someone I couldn't see. I grabbed the first aid kit and a blanket, draping it over his shoulders. "Hey, you're gonna be okay," I told him. "Just sit tight." He didn't answer. I radioed the station to call for a med-evac, but the signal was weak, cutting in and out like it had the day before. I managed to get a response, but they said the chopper couldn't get through until morning. Weather conditions were, bad snow was starting to fall again. Great, I thought. That meant it was just me and Thomas for the night. I sat down across from him, watching him closely. Something about the way he was rocking back and forth, mumbling to himself, put me on edge. "Thomas," I said, trying to bring him back, "tell me what happened. What did you see?" He stopped rocking. For a moment, I thought I'd gotten through to him. Then he looked up at me, his face twisted into something between a grin and a grimace. "They made me eat," he whispered. I blinked at him, not sure I'd heard him right. "What?" "The others," he said. "They made me eat. It's the only way to survive. The only way to stop the hunger." My stomach turned. I wanted to believe he was just delirious, but the way he said it, calm and matter-of-fact, made my skin crawl. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice growing sharper. "The hunger, it's inside you. It gets inside your head. It makes you—" He stopped, his body convulsing suddenly. His hands clawed at his chest, his breathing shallow and raspy. "Thomas!" I jumped up, grabbing his arms to steady him. "What's happening?" His eyes rolled back, and his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Then slowly, his head tipped back, and a low, guttural sound escaped his throat. "Help! Me!" he gasped. I didn't know what to do. I'd seen seizures before hell. I'd treated worse in Vietnam, but this wasn't just a seizure. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and I swear I could see his veins turning dark under the fireplace light. "Thomas, stay with me," I shouted, shaking him. He stopped convulsing, his body going limp. I leaned in to check his pulse, and that's when his eyes snapped open. They weren't the same. His pupils were gone, replaced by a faint, sickly blue glow. And his teeth, they looked sharper somehow, like they didn't fit in his mouth anymore. He lunged at me, his hands clawing at my face. I stumbled back, grabbing for the knife at my belt. "Thomas, stop!" I shouted, but there was no reasoning with him. Whatever was left of the man I'd found was gone. He was something else now. I slashed at him with the knife, catching him across the arm. He didn't flinch, didn't bleed, just kept coming. His movements were jerky, his joints cracking as if his bones were rearranging themselves inside his skin. I backed up, my heart racing, and grabbed my rifle from the wall. "Don't make me do this," I shouted, aiming it at him. For a moment, he froze, tilting his head like he was listening to something. Then he spoke, but it wasn't his voice. It was deeper, layered, like two voices speaking at once. "It's coming." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept my rifle loaded and my back to the wall, watching Thomas like a hawk. He was tied to the chair now, his wrists and ankles bound with rope I'd found in the storeroom. I'd had no choice. He'd thrown himself at me like a wild animal after saying whatever that thing was that came out of his mouth. "It's coming." That voice still echoed in my head, deep and layered, with a weight that didn't sound human. After I tied him down, he went limp again, his head lolling forward like he'd passed out. But every so often, I'd hear him muttering under his breath, too low for me to make out the words. Outside, the snowstorm had hit full force. The wind howled against the cabin, rattling the windows. It sounded almost alive, like it was whispering to itself. I kept checking my watch, counting down the hours until morning. The rescue team would come once the weather cleared. I just had to hold out until then. But deep down, I had a gnawing feeling that even the rescue team wouldn't know what to do with Thomas. It must have been close to dawn when things took a turn for the worse. I'd been nodding off in the chair, fighting to stay awake, when I heard a noise. A low, wet cracking sound, like ice splitting in a frozen lake. I sat up with a jolt. my eyes snapping to Thomas. He was still in the chair, but his body, it wasn't right. His head twitched violently, jerking from side to side. His shoulders hunched forward, and the blanket I'd draped over him earlier slid to the floor. His arms strained against the ropes, his fingers twitching like he was trying to grab something that wasn't there. "Thomas," I said cautiously, gripping the rifle in my lap. "You awake?" He didn't answer. Instead, his head tilted back and his mouth opened wide, too wide. His jaw stretched unnaturally, the tendons in his neck snapping as his bones shifted and cracked. "Thomas!" I shouted, my voice cracking. His head snapped toward me, and I swear I felt my blood turn to ice. His face wasn't his anymore. His skin was stretched tight over his skull, his eyes glowing faintly blue in the dim light of the fire. His teeth, they were sharp, jagged, like shards of glass. Before I could react, he let out a sound I'll never forget. A scream, but not a human one. It was a deep, guttural roar, layered with other sounds like multiple voices screaming all at once. The force of it rattled the windows, and for a second, I thought the cabin would come down around me. I raised my rifle instinctively, aiming it at his chest. "Stop! Whatever this is, stop!" But Thomas wasn't Thomas anymore. With another sickening crack, his arms broke free of the ropes. His fingers had elongated, the nails turning dark and pointed like claws. He lunged at me, the chair toppling over as he broke his legs free. I fired. The shot hit him square in the shoulder, but it barely slowed him down. He kept coming, his movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. "Stay back!" I shouted, firing again. This time the bullet hit his chest, knocking him back slightly. He staggered, but instead of falling, he let out another one of those horrid screams and kept coming. I scrambled back, grabbing the silver combat knife from my belt. I'd never believed in the supernatural stories the elders told, but something told me this thing wasn't going to die from just bullets. He lunged at me again, his claws swiping inches from my face. I slashed at his arm with the knife, and this time it worked. The blade cut deep, and his skin split like dry paper. Black, tar-like blood oozed from the wound, hissing and smoking as it hit the floor. Thomas, if I could still call him that, recoiled, letting out a high-pitched shriek. I didn't waste any time. I lunged forward, driving the knife into his chest, right where his heart should have been. He froze, his glowing eyes widening. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then his body convulsed violently, throwing me backward into the wall. I hit the floor hard, the breath knocked out of me. By the time I looked up, he was gone. The cabin door hung open, snow blowing in through the gap. I staggered to my feet, my entire body shaking. Outside, the storm was still raging, but I caught a glimpse of something moving in the distance. A tall, thin shadow, disappearing into the trees at an impossible speed. Before I could even process what had just happened, the cabin grew silent. The wind stopped, and for a moment, all I could hear was my own ragged breathing. Then I felt it. A presence. I turned slowly, and there it was, standing just beyond the tree line. The wendigo. It was taller than I'd imagined, at least 15 feet, maybe more. Its gray, desiccated skin clung to its bones, and its massive antlers were carved with strange, glowing symbols. Its eyes burned with the same faint blue light, and its mouth twisted into something that might have been a grin. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and suffocating. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, without a sound, it vanished into the trees, moving faster than anything should be able to. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the snow biting at my face. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't just a legend, it was real. And it wasn't finished with me yet. I didn't go back into the cabin. I couldn't. The sight of those broken ropes, the black blood burned into the floor, and the chair lying toppled over it was too much. Instead, I stood there in the snow, staring into the forest. My hands were shaking, even though they were tucked deep into my gloves. The wendigo was out there somewhere. So was whatever Thomas had turned into. I didn't know which one scared me more. The storm had eased up a bit, but the sky was still heavy with clouds. The sun was somewhere behind them, but it didn't feel like daytime. Everything was gray and quiet, so quiet that the crunch of my boots on the snow sounded deafening. I didn't have much of a plan. All I knew was that I couldn't stay here. The rescue team wasn't coming until morning, and sitting inside that cabin felt like waiting to die. So I grabbed my gear, threw a few supplies into my pack, and headed out. The first thing I did was check the tree line where I'd last seen the wendigo. As much as I didn't want to, I knew I had to follow it. If I didn't, it would just come back for me. Or worse, for someone else. The tracks were easy to find. They were massive deep hoof prints in the snow, spaced far apart, like the thing had been running on two legs. They led west, toward the deeper part of the forest, where most people never go. I followed them for hours. The deeper I went, the harder it got to breathe. The air felt heavier, colder, like the forest itself didn't want me there. The trees were thicker, their branches tangled like skeletons reaching for the sky. Eventually, the tracks led to a clearing, and that's where I found it, the blood. It was smeared across the snow in long streaks, as if something had been dragged. My stomach turned as I noticed bits of torn fabric scattered around part of a jacket, maybe a shirt. It didn't take much to realize what it was. Whoever it belonged to, they didn't survive. Ahead, the tracks disappeared into a cave, not the same one as before. This one was wider, more open, with jagged rocks sticking out of the ground like teeth. I didn't want to go inside. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to run, but I couldn't. The first thing I noticed when I stepped inside was the cold. It wasn't like the cold outside, it was worse, sharper, the kind of cold that cuts straight to your bones. The walls were covered in the same strange carvings I'd seen in the first cave, but these were different. They looked angrier somehow. Deep scratches, almost frantic, like someone had carved them in a hurry. The symbols glowed faintly blue, casting eerie shadows that flickered against the walls. And then there was the smell, that same rotting metallic stench I'd noticed before, only stronger now. I pulled my scarf up over my nose, but it didn't help much. I kept moving deeper, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The air felt heavier with every step, like the cave was pressing down on me. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure something would hear it. That's when I saw it. A pile of bones. They were scattered across the floor, some broken, some gnawed on. Human bones. I felt my stomach churn, but I forced myself to keep going. At the center of the cave, the ground opened up into a massive pit. The sides were slick with ice, the bottom too far down to see. But I could hear something. Something moving. A low, guttural growl rose from the darkness, followed by the sound of claws scraping against stone. I froze, gripping my rifle tightly. My flashlight beam trembled as it flitted across the walls, landing on a shape just beyond the edge of the pit. It was Thomas. Or what was left of him. He was crouched over, his back to me, his limbs twisted and elongated. His skin hung loosely from his frame, stretched and torn, with patches of blackened flesh where the transformation had taken hold. He wasn't human anymore. Thomas, I whispered, even though I knew it wasn't him. He turned his head slowly, his glowing blue eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he let out a roar, deafening in the confined space of the cave, and charged. I fired before I even realized what I was doing. The first shot hit him in the leg, but it didn't stop him. He moved unnaturally fast, his claws scraping against the icy floor as he lunged for me. I fired again, this time hitting him in the chest. He staggered, but only for a second. "Stay back!" I shouted, my voice echoing through the cave. But he didn't stop. I stumbled backward, my boot catching on a loose rock, and fell hard onto the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Thomas, or whatever he'd become, was almost on top of me now, his claws outstretched, his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. Desperate, I reached for the knife on my belt. My fingers found the handle just as he lunged. I swung wildly, catching him across the shoulder. He let out an ear-splitting screech and recoiled, giving me just enough time to scramble to my feet. I didn't wait for him to recover. I turned and ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I sprinted toward the cave's entrance. The growling grew louder behind me, followed by the sound of claws scraping against stone. I burst out into the open air, the cold wind hitting me like a wall. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the clearing. Only then did I turn around. Thomas was standing at the mouth of the cave, his glowing eyes burning into me. He didn't follow me out. For some reason, he stayed inside, his body twitching and jerking like he was struggling against something. Then he let out one final roar, turned, and disappeared back into the darkness. I didn't have time to catch my breath before I felt it again, that same suffocating presence I'd felt earlier. I turned slowly, and there it was. The wendigo stood at the edge of the clearing, its massive frame silhouetted against the gray sky. Its antlers gleamed in the faint light, and its glowing eyes bored into me with an intensity that made my knees go weak. It didn't move, but I knew what it was doing, watching, waiting. And for the first time in my life, I realized I wasn't the hunter anymore. I was the prey. I stood there frozen, my breath fogging up in the icy air. The wendigo didn't move, it just stood at the edge of the clearing like it was waiting for something. Its eyes burned into me, glowing blue and unblinking, and I swear I could feel its hunger a deep, gnawing emptiness that made my stomach twist. I tightened my grip on the rifle. My fingers were trembling, the cold biting into the exposed skin around my gloves. But it wasn't just the cold. It was fear. Pure, bone-deep fear. I couldn't outrun this thing. I couldn't hide from it. I didn't even know if I could kill it. But what other choice did I have? Slowly, I raised the gun, aiming for its chest. "Come on," I muttered under my breath. "Let's get this over with." The wendigo cocked its head to the side, almost like it was amused. Then it moved. It didn't run like a normal animal. It didn't even feel like it touched the ground. One moment, it was at the edge of the clearing, and the next it was 10 feet closer, moving so fast it blurred. I fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the forest. The bullet hit its shoulder, jerking it back slightly, but it didn't fall. It let out a sound that was something between a growl and a laugh, the noise so deep and guttural it made my chest vibrate. I fired again. This time, the bullet caught it in the chest. It staggered, its massive frame swaying for a moment. But then, it straightened up. My heart sank. The bullets weren't doing enough. The wendigo let out a blood-curdling roar and charged. Its speed was impossible, like a shadow streaking across the snow. I barely had time to throw myself to the side before it hit me. I rolled onto my back, scrambling to reload the rifle, but the wendigo was already looming over me. Its antlers glinted in the faint light, and its eyes burned brighter, locking onto mine. For a moment, everything stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My mind was filled with this overwhelming sense of hunger, bottomless, endless hunger. It wasn't mine. It was the wendigo's. It was inside my head. Just when I thought it was over, the wendigo stopped. Its head snapped to the side, like it had sensed something. Then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the forest, moving faster than my eyes could follow. I lay there in the snow, my chest heaving. My head was spinning, my thoughts racing. Why had it left? Where was it going? I forced myself to my feet, using the rifle as a crutch. My eyes followed the direction it had gone, and then I saw it. In the distance, through the trees, there was an opening in the ground, like a wound in the earth. Another cave. I didn't want to follow it. Every instinct I had screamed to turn around and go back. But something pulled me forward. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the thought of all the people this thing had taken Thomas, the hikers, maybe more. Or maybe it was that deep gnawing voice in the back of my head that whispered, "You have to end this." Asterisk. I stumbled into the cave, the darkness swallowing me whole. The air was heavy and cold, colder than anything I'd felt before. My flashlight flickered as I made my way deeper, the beam barely cutting through the shadows. The walls were covered in more of the strange carvings, the symbols glowing faintly blue. At the center of the cave was a massive chamber. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The walls were lined with bone human and animal, all arranged in intricate patterns. At the center of the chamber was an altar, carved from stone and slick with ice. And standing beside it was the Wendigo. It wasn't alone. 3 more rescue team members were sprawled on the ground around the altar. Their bodies were twisted and broken, their faces frozen in expressions of pure terror. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to keep moving. The Wendigo turned slowly to face me, its massive frame filling the chamber. It didn't attack. It just stared, tilting its head as if it were studying me. Then it raised one skeletal hand and pointed to the altar. I didn't understand at first. Then I saw it. On the altar were a set of objects: an old leather-bound book, a stone knife, and a small wooden bowl. The carvings on the altar matched the ones on the cave walls, glowing faintly in the dim light. The Wendigo growled softly, a low, rumbling noise that made the ground vibrate. I didn't need words to understand what it was telling me. The curse. This was the source. I didn't know what I was doing, but I didn't have time to think. The Wendigo was watching me, its glowing eyes burning into my back as I approached the altar. My hands shook as I picked up the book, its pages worn and brittle. The symbols inside matched the ones on the walls, and though I couldn't read them, I understood enough. This was how I could stop it. The knife was next. It was cold and heavy in my hand, the blade dull but sharp enough to cut. I glanced at the wooden bowl, its surface stained dark with something that looked like dried blood. I looked back at the Wendigo, and for the first time, I saw something in its eyes: anger, fear. I realized then what it wanted. The curse couldn't be broken without a sacrifice. I didn't hesitate. Maybe I should have, but at that moment, with the Wendigo looming over me and the weight of the forest pressing down, I knew what had to be done. I gripped the knife tightly and sliced across my palm, blood dripping into the bowl. The carvings on the altar flared to life, glowing brighter and brighter until the entire chamber was bathed in blue light. The Wendigo roared, its skeletal frame writhing as the light engulfed it. For the first time, it looked weak, vulnerable. I stumbled back, my vision blurring as the light grew brighter. My body felt heavy, my mind slipping into darkness. As I collapsed to the ground, I saw the Wendigo stagger toward the altar, its body dissolving into ash. And then everything went black. When I woke up, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The roaring wind, the Wendigo's growls, even the pounding in my chest, everything was gone. All I could hear was the faint drip of water somewhere in the cave. My head felt heavy, and it took a moment for my eyes to adjust to the dim light. I was lying on the cold stone floor, the knife still clutched in my hand. The altar was glowing faintly, but the light was fading fast. The Wendigo, it was gone. I pushed myself up, my arms shaking under my weight. The chamber felt different now. Still eerie, still wrong, but the suffocating pressure I'd felt when I walked in was gone. Whatever had been keeping the Wendigo here, it was broken. I should have felt relief. I didn't. As I stood there, I realized that something wasn't right. My body felt off. My legs were heavy, my arms numb. When I brought my hand up to wipe the sweat from my face, I froze. The cuts on my palm were gone, completely healed. But the skin wasn't normal. It was pale, almost gray, with dark veins webbing across it. "No," I whispered, taking a step back. I caught sight of my reflection in a shard of ice on the wall. My eyes, They weren't my eyes anymore. They glowed faintly blue, just like the wendigos. It hit me all at once. The curse wasn't just broken, it had moved. To me, I don't know how long I stood there, staring at my reflection. Minutes? Hours? Time didn't feel real anymore. All I knew was that I couldn't stay. The curse was still alive, still hungry, and now it was inside me. If I stayed in the cabin, if the rescue team found me, I couldn't let that happen. I stumbled out of the cave, the cold air hitting me like a punch to the chest. The storm had started again, snow swirling around me in blinding waves. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't stop. The forest stretched out endlessly in every direction, the trees towering over me like silent witnesses. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, one step after another, carrying me deeper into the blizzard. As I walked, I started hearing things whispers, faint and far away, but growing louder with each step. Marcus. It wasn't the Wendigo's voice. It wasn't Thomas's either. It was mine. Marcus, the voice called again, you can't stop it. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head now. The hunger. That deep, endless hunger. It clawed at my stomach, gnawed at my mind. I clenched my fists so hard my nails dug into my palms, but the pain didn't help. I didn't know how long I walked in the storm, but eventually, I didn't feel the cold anymore. My skin was numb, my body lighter than it should have been. When I finally stopped, I was standing in an open clearing, surrounded by snow and silence. I looked down at my hands. They were no longer mine. The glow in my eyes grew brighter, reflecting off the snow at my feet. I took a deep breath, the cold air filling my lungs, and for the first time the hunger didn't scare me. It felt right. They sent a search party a week later. It took them days to find the cave, even longer to piece together what had happened. They didn't find me. All they found was my journal, lying in the snow near the cabin, and a trail of massive hoofprints leading into the deep woods. The area was declared off-limits. The story in the news was simple. Ranger Marcus Blackwood disappeared after a freak snowstorm, presumed dead. But the locals knew better. The elders, especially. "This isn't the end," one of them said, shaking his head as he stared into the forest. "The long walker always returns. It's the hunger. It can't be stopped." Years passed, and the story faded, but every winter, when the storms rolled through Blackwood Forest, there were sightings. A shadow, impossibly tall, moving through the blizzard. Hoofprints in the snow where no animal should have been. Sometimes, people still go missing. A hiker, a hunter, a ranger. It doesn't happen often, just enough to remind folks of the stories, just enough to keep them looking over their shoulders. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howls through the trees, some say you can still hear it. A voice, calling your name. My name is Catherine Winters, but most folks just call me Kit. I've been a ranger in the Blue Ridge Mountains for over a decade, and before that, I worked search and rescue. Out here, you get used to the quiet. The world doesn't come looking for you in the forest. It has its own rhythm, its own rules. The only company I really have is Max, my German Shepherd. He's smarter than most people I've met, loyal too. He's been with me for over 5 years, and we know each other like family. It's peaceful, sure, but it's also lonely. That's fine by me. People like to talk about the beauty of the mountains, the crisp air, the fiery leaves in autumn, but they don't see what I see. The shadows, the silence that feels too heavy, too still, the way the forest watches you when you're not looking. Not many folks wander into Shadow Creek Valley anymore. The old-timers have stories, legends. They call them about things that stalk these woods. Shadow walkers, they were called. Creatures that don't belong to this world, slipping in and out of the darkness like smoke. I never paid much attention to the stories, not until 5 years ago when I lost my brother Liam. He went hiking out here on a late October evening in 1978 and never came back. I tried to save him, I really did. I led every search crew, combed every inch of the valley for weeks. All we found was his backpack, shredded, like something clawed it apart. They said it was a bear. That's what they always say. I don't believe that. There's something out here, something worse than bears. The fire tower has been my home ever since. Sitting high above the trees, it feels safe, even with the forest stretching endlessly below. I keep my Remington 700 rifle close, tweaked just the way I like it. I've solved a few missing persons cases over the years, but not Liam's. His journal, the one I found in his things, is the only clue I have. And I've read those pages enough times to know he was scared of something. He wrote about shadows that moved when they shouldn't. Eyes watching him in the dark. Asterisk, asterisk. I try not to think about it too much. The forest has a way of messing with you if you let it. But today felt wrong. The air was colder than it should have been for early autumn, and the sunset came quick, tugging the light behind the mountains faster than usual. Max was acting strange all morning, agitated, restless. He kept pacing the tower platform, ears perked, and would stop now and then to growl low in his throat. It wasn't like him. Max was a steady hand, unshakable. Whatever had him nervous was real. I grabbed my gear rifle slung across my back, flashlight clipped to my belt, and headed down the tower. The forest was quiet, silent in a way that made the hair on my arms stand straight. No birds, no insects. Just stillness. That's when I found it. A clearing, just a few hundred yards off the main trail. 3 deer lay there, mutilated and torn apart, lying in a perfect circle. Their bodies had been arranged, like they meant something. Their eyes stared up, glassy and lifeless, blood pooling into the damp, dark soil beneath them. "What the hell?" I whispered. Max whined behind me, his tail tucked so far between his legs it was practically gone. He refused to take another step closer, planting himself firmly behind a tree. I didn't blame him. I knelt, breathing slowly, and noticed something strange. Tracks. Large ones. They were pressed deep into the dirt, larger than any bear I'd ever seen. 3 toes, tipped with sharp, curved claws. I ran my fingers along one of the impressions that didn't make sense. No animal I knew of had tracks like that. What's worse, the tracks didn't just lead away, they circled the deer, like something had been walking around them, watching. A sudden crack of branches snapped me out of my thoughts. Max barked sharply, his hackles rising in warning. I stood quickly, flashlight sweeping through the trees, rifle in hand. The beam caught nothing but shadows, but I swear I heard it something moving, fast, just beyond where the light could reach. Then came the sound, low, guttural howls, echoing from different directions, twisting and overlapping like a warped symphony. I couldn't tell how many there were, but it sounded like a pack. "All right, Max," I muttered, backing away slowly. "Let's go. Now." Reluctantly, Max followed as I hurried back toward the trail. The howls didn't stop, they chased us, growing louder, more urgent, until we finally reached the tower. I climbed up to the platform 2 steps at a time and slammed the door shut behind us. Breathing heavily, I stood at the edge, staring down into the forest below. The howls had stopped, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, the woods were. Waiting, watching. And the tracks? They were burned into my mind. I had no idea what the hell I was dealing with, but whatever it wasn't natural. The sun was gone by the time I made it back up the fire tower, and the valley below had fallen into that kind of pitch-black darkness you only get out here in the mountains. It wasn't the kind of dark you could shake off with a flashlight. It clung to everything, thick and heavy, like it belonged there. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, catching my breath. Max had already curled up tight by the corner of the room, his head down, body still tense. His ears twitched at every little creak of the tower, like he was waiting for something or someone to come knocking. I wanted to tell him everything was fine, But the truth was, I didn't believe that myself. I grabbed my field journal and jotted down the details, the deer, the tracks, the howls. Writing it out usually helped clear my head, but tonight, it felt pointless. Whatever I'd run into out there didn't belong in the neat little boxes of logic I was used to working with. I mean, those tracks, they were too big to be a wolf, too misshapen to be a bear. And the howls? I'd spent years learning the sounds of the forest. I'd never heard anything like that before. The radio crackled to life beside me, making me jump. "Kit, you there?" It was Jack, one of the local farmers who lived near the alley. I grabbed the radio. "I'm here, Jack. What's going on?" Jack's voice was shaky, like he'd been spooked by something. "Lost 2 cattle tonight. Found one of them torn up real mess. Dan said he saw something earlier, though. Bigger than a bear. It was moving fast, too." I felt my stomach twist at his words. Did he say what it looked like? Didn't get a good look. Said it was tall, upright, walked like a man, but it sure as hell wasn't one. Jack paused, and I could almost hear him swallowing hard on the other end. "Think there's something we should know about, Kit?" I hesitated, my eyes darting toward Max, who was staring out the window, his body rigid. "I don't know, Jack, but stay inside tonight. Lock everything up tight. I'll check out the area in the morning." He didn't argue. "All right. You be careful out there." The line went dead with a click, leaving me alone with the cold hum of the quiet. I spent a while pacing the tower, running through the possibilities in my head. Maybe it was some kind of animal we hadn't seen in this region before. Something migratory, maybe. Or maybe, though I hated to admit it was something else. Something people didn't talk about out loud. The legends, the stories about shadow walkers. It all felt too far-fetched. But then again, so did everything I'd seen today. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stayed up watching the valley, my rifle balanced on the windowsill. Every so often, I'd catch movement in the distant shadows slipping between the trees, too fast and too fluid to be a trick of the light. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, that I was just jumpy after what I saw earlier, but deep down, I knew better. Around midnight, Max started growling again, low and steady. He was staring out the window, his eyes narrowed, his body stiff like a coiled spring. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees below. The beam cut through the darkness, but all it showed me were trees and bushes swaying gently in the wind. Then I saw it. Just for a second, the flashlight caught a pair of eyes glowing amber, glaring back at me. They didn't flinch or move. They just stared. I froze, gripping the flashlight tighter. The eyes blinked once, then disappeared into the shadows. I shivered, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing up here in the tower. They knew where I was. They were watching. Around 3 in the morning, something else happened. I saw a smoker, at least I thought it was smokerizing from the treetops, about half a mile from the tower. It wasn't thick like a campfire or a brush fire, just a faint wisp of gray curling into the sky. It didn't make sense. Nobody camps this deep in the valley anymore. Not after all the stories. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and whistled for Max. He hesitated at the door, looking at me like he thought I was crazy for going out again. Honestly, I didn't blame him. But he stayed by my side like he always did, tail low, his nose twitching. The cold hit me as soon as we stepped outside, sharper than it should have been for this time of year. Each breath came out in a cloud as we made our way down the trail, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the ground. It didn't take long to find the campsite or what was left of it. The tent was shredded, its fabric flapping weakly in the cold breeze. Gear was scattered everywhere. A half-open sleeping bag, a lantern tipped on its side, a backpack ripped in two. The ground was a mess of footprints, some human, some not. Blood. There was blood, too. Not a lot, but enough to know that someone had been hurting badly. Max growled again, his nose pointed toward the trees. That's when I saw the trail. drops of blood leading away from the campsite, but not along the ground. They went up. Asterisk, asterisk. I stared, my flashlight following the streaks of red as they climbed one of the towering hemlocks. Branches above were broken, snapped clean like something big had passed through. Something that didn't belong on this earth. The sound of whispering came next. At least, I thought it was whispering. It was faint, almost too quiet to hear, but it sent a chill straight up my spine. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it wasn't far. "We're leaving," I whispered to Max, my voice shaking. He didn't argue. As we turned to head back to the tower, I caught one last glimpse of something in the trees. A figure tall, hunched, wrapped in shadows like a living nightmare. It wasn't watching me. It was watching the blood trail, like it was hunting. I didn't wait around to find out what happened next. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The image of that figure shadowy and hunched kept flashing in my mind, no matter how hard I tried to forget it. What was worse, though, was the whispering. Even now, hours later, I swore I could still hear it. Like it wasn't outside in the woods, but in my head. Max hadn't moved from his spot by the door. He didn't bother lying down, didn't close his eyes. It was like he was standing guard, ready for whatever came next. The sun finally poked over the horizon, but it didn't bring the relief I was hoping for. The sky stayed dull and gray, and the forest below seemed darker than usual, even in daylight. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, blanketing Shadow Creek Valley in an eerie, heavy stillness. When the radio crackled again, I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Kit?" It was Sam, one of the rangers from the nearby station. His voice sounded tired and shaken, like I wasn't the only one who'd had a rough night. "We've got something down here you're going to want to see. North Ridge Trail. About a mile out." "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, even though my hands were starting to shake. "Not sure," Sam replied. "But it's bad. A hiker, I think. He's alive, sort of." "Sort of?" I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my gear, whistled for Max, and headed down the fire tower. The weight of my rifle, heavy and familiar on my back, was the only thing keeping me grounded. The hike to North Ridge Trail felt longer than it should have. The fog was so thick it swallowed everything, a wall of gray that muffled sound and made the forest feel like it was closing in around me. I kept Max close, and even he seemed uneasy, his ears twitching every few seconds. When I reached the spot Sam had called about, I stopped cold. There were 3 of them, Sam, Dan, and Pete, all standing in a tight circle around something on the ground. Their faces didn't hide much. Whatever they were looking at had shaken them to their cores. "Kit," Sam said, looking up at me, "I don't think I've ever seen anything like this." I stepped closer, and that's when I saw him. The man on the ground was alive, technically, but he looked like he shouldn't be. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his breathing was shallow and ragged, each inhale rattling like broken glass. His clothes were torn to shreds, and his arms were wrong. The muscles bulged unnaturally, his fingers ending in claws that didn't look like they belonged on a human hand. His face was streaked with blood and dirt, and when his eyes flicked open bright, glowing amber eye stumbled backward, my heart racing. "What the hell happened to him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Pete shook his head. "We found him like this, wandering in the woods. He collapsed when we got close." The man, if you could still call him that, groaned weakly and tried to move. But his body didn't seem to work right. His limbs twitched and jerked in ways that made my stomach turn. "Do we move him?" Dan asked. "No," I said quickly. "Not yet." I crouched down next to him, keeping my rifle close, and asked, "What happened to you? Can you tell me what did this?" His head tilted toward me just enough for me to see his teeth sharp, jagged, like an animal's. My chest tightened as he rasped out one word, barely audible but clear enough to send a chill straight through me. "Pack." We carried him back to the ranger station. It was the only choice we had. Leaving him out there wasn't an option, and none of us were ready to admit the obvious. Whatever happened to this man, it wasn't normal. Max didn't want to go anywhere near him. He stayed a safe distance away, growling low in his throat every time the man twitched or made a noise. The others noticed too. Pete kept glancing nervously between the man and Max, like the dog's behavior confirmed everything we were too afraid to say out loud. Once we reached the station, we laid him on one of the cots in the back room and locked the door. Sam left to radio for help, but I knew deep down that no amount of backup was going to fix this. While we waited, I found myself pacing, my thoughts spinning in circles. I couldn't stop replaying what he'd said. Pack, asterisk, asterisk. What did that mean? Was he talking about wolves? No, I thought, not wolves. My brother's journal was still tucked in my pack, and I pulled it out now, flipping through the pages for the 100th time. Liam had written about the same thing. A pack, watching him from the shadows. Asterisk, asterisk. He described their glowing eyes, their speed, the way they moved in unison, like one mind controlling many bodies. The scribbles in the margins were frantic, paranoid. He'd mentioned transformation, but I'd always thought he meant the way fear could change a person, make them see things that weren't really there. But now, I glanced toward the back room, where the man lay twitching and groaning behind a locked door. I couldn't ignore the possibility anymore. This was real. Whatever Liam had been afraid of, whatever he'd been running from when he disappeared 5 years ago, it hadn't left Shadow Creek Valley. And now it was happening again. As night fell, we made the decision to stay inside the station. Nobody said it out loud, but none of us wanted to be out in the woods after dark, not after everything we'd seen. The forest around us came alive as the sun disappeared. The howls started again, low and distant at first, but growing louder and closer with each passing hour. Sam tried to keep us calm, insisting it was just wolves, but we all knew better. Wolves didn't howl like that. At some point, the man in the back room started thrashing violently, clawing at the walls and letting out noises that didn't sound human. Max barked and growled at the door, but I didn't dare open it. Then came the sound we'd been dreading. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, circling the station, too large to belong to any animal I knew. We huddled together, rifles in hand, hearts pounding in unison. And as the first shadow darted past the window, I realized with absolute certainty, the pack was here. I didn't know it was possible to survive a night like that. None of us slept. How could we, with those heavy footsteps circling the station and the howls that seemed to come from every direction at once? Every now and then, there'd be a thump against the walls, like something testing its strength, seeing how far it could push us before we broke. Max stayed at my feet, growling softly, his eyes locked on the door to the back room. The transformed hiker hadn't stopped thrashing. Every few minutes, there was a loud crash or a guttural scream. I was sure he was going to break through the door at any moment. Somehow, though, the night passed without any of us getting killed. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the windows, the noises outside stopped. The forest was silent again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of silence. It felt more like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting. I let out a shaky sigh of relief and lowered my rifle. Around me, the others did the same. Sam muttered something about checking the perimeter, but I stopped him. "No one's going outside alone," I said firmly. "Not until we know it's safe." Truth was, I didn't think it ever would be. While Sam and Pete worked on getting the radio fixed-door call for help last night, had been cut off by the static eye, decided to check on the man in the back room. I placed a hand on the door, hesitating. My gut told me not to open it, but if there was any chance of finding answers, I had to try. "Stay here," I told Max. He let out a low whine, but he didn't follow me. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, rifle in hand. The air smelled rank, like sweat and blood, and something wild. The man was still on the cot, but he looked worse than before. His skin had gone pale gray, mottled with dark patches. His arms had grown, the muscles bulging unnaturally, and his hands weren't hands anymore. They were claws, sharp and black. His breathing came out in sharp, ragged gasps, and when his glowing amber eyes snapped open and locked on me, I took an instinctive step back. "Help!" he rasped, his voice barely human. "They're coming. No one stops the pack." "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my heart was racing. "Who are they?" "Not who." He groaned, his body jerking violently. "What? They'll take everything. Every part of me." He let out a scream, his body arching off the cot. For a second, his face twisted back into something almost human. His eyes softened, and his voice broke as he choked out, "Kill me, please, before it's too late." It was the only human thing he'd said, and I could see the torment in his eyes. Part of me wanted to pull the trigger right then and there, end his suffering. But I needed answers. There was too much I didn't understand. Before I could say anything else, though, his body seized again, his back arching so far I thought it might snap. And then he went still. I stayed there for what felt like forever, waiting to see if it was really over. Slowly, I reached for his wrist, checking for a pulse. His eyes flew open, and before I could react, he lunged. I stumbled back, barely bringing my rifle up in time to shove him off me. He hit the floor, snarling and clawing like a feral animal. His scream wasn't human anymore, it was something out of a nightmare. Max burst into the room, teeth bared, barking and growling. The others came rushing in seconds later, and it took all of us to pin the man to the ground, or whatever he was now. Sam raised his rifle, but I stopped him again. "No, he's changing. We need to know why." Sam glared at me. "Kit, look at him. He's gone." I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was spinning too fast, trying to piece together what was happening. The journal. Liam's journal. He'd written about this, about people being turned into something they weren't supposed to be. There had to be a way to stop it. There had to be. When the man finally stopped moving, we tied him up and left him in the back room. It didn't feel like a victory. None of this did. That's when Sam told me about the footprints. "We found a trail," he said, his voice tight. "Big ones. 3 claws, just like you said." "Where do they lead?" I asked. Pete answered, his face pale. "South, toward the old mine." The mine. I hadn't thought about that place in years. It had been abandoned back in the 50s, after a collapse killed a dozen workers. Nobody went near it anymore, it was too dangerous, not to mention steeped in stories about spirits and curses. But now, it seemed like the only place that could hold answers. "We're going," I said, grabbing my pack. "You can't be serious," Pete said. "After everything we've seen." "That's exactly why we're going," I snapped. "Whatever's out there, it started with that mine. If we don't stop it now, we're next." The hike to the mine was the longest of my life. The forest felt different, heavier, like the trees were leaning closer, listening. The whole way, Max was on edge, his nose twitching, his ears perked. Every so often, he'd pause and let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. When we reached the entrance, I understood why. The mine looked like something out of a nightmare, jagged rocks jutting out like teeth, the darkness inside stretching endlessly. Around the entrance, the ground was littered with boneless animals, mostly, but some looked human. My stomach churned. "Stay sharp," I told the others, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "We go in. We find out what's going on, and we get out." They nodded, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They didn't believe we'd make it out. Neither did I. The air inside the mine was thick and stale, and the deeper we went, the worse it got. The walls were slick with moisture, and our footsteps echoed far too loudly in the cramped space. Max stayed close, his ears flat against his head, his tail low. Then we found it. The den. It was a cavern, wide and open, lit by an eerie glow coming from some kind of fungus on the walls. The floor was scattered with bones and torn clothing, and in the center was something that made my stomach drop. A pile of bodies, twisted and broken, some of them half transformed, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and terror. Around them were claw marks, deep gouges in the stone, like something had been here. Something big. Max let out a growl, and I turned just in time to see the shadows start to move. They were here. The pack. We froze. None of us moved, not even a breath loud enough to disturb the suffocating stillness inside the mine. But Max wasn't still. His growl grew louder, deeper, his body stiff as he crouched low to the ground, teeth bared. He'd seen something we hadn't yet. Then, slowly, we saw it too. The shadows around the edges of the cavern began to shift, not the kind of shifting you'd see from a flickering light or someone moving their flashlight. No, these shadows were alive, stretching and curling like smoke, circling us. At first, it was subtle, hard to believe. Then, a pair of glowing amber eyes appeared in the dark, followed by another, and another. "They're everywhere," Pete whispered, his voice barely audible. "Stay together," I said firmly, gripping my rifle as tightly as I could. My palms were slick with sweat, but I couldn't let the fear take me. Not yet. No sudden moves. The first growl came from directly in front of us, echoing off the cavern walls like it was coming from all sides. Then another growl answered it, deeper and louder, from somewhere behind us. My heart was pounding so hard I thought they could hear it. Then they stepped out of the shadows. The creatures were massive, taller than I'd imagined, easily 8 feet when they stood upright. Their bodies rippled with muscle, covered in dark, matted fur, their wolf-like faces twisted into snarls, teeth gleaming in the dim light. What struck me most, though, were their eyes glowing amber with a spark of red that flickered when they focused on us. They didn't charge right away. They didn't need to. They were studying us, circling like predators, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "This isn't happening," Pete whispered, his voice shaking. "This can't be real." "It's real," I said quietly, my voice calm despite the fear. "Focus. Don't let them separate us." The first one lunged, faster than I thought possible. I barely had time to aim before I pulled the trigger, the rifle echoing like thunder in the cramped cavern. The bullet hit its mark, slamming into the creature's shoulder. It stumbled, blood spraying across the rocks, but it didn't go down. "They don't go down easy," I said, firing again. This time, the creature let out a high-pitched screech, retreating back into the shadows. The others didn't wait. They attacked all at once, moving with terrifying speed. Max leapt at one of them, his teeth sinking into its leg, and it howled in pain, swiping at him with sharp claws. I fired again and again, each shot lighting up the cavern for a split second. But it was chaos. Sam and Pete were shooting too, their voices lost in the deafening roars and growls that filled the air. "They're too fast," Sam shouted, backing toward the cavern wall. "We can't fight them like this." He was right. They weren't just strong, they were smart. They worked together, herding us, keeping us off balance. One of them lunged at Pete, claws raking across his arm as he screamed in pain. I turned and fired, the shot hitting the creature square in the chest. It collapsed, but only for a moment before it started moving again, slower this time, but just as dangerous. "They're not animals," I said under my breath. "They're hunting us." We managed to retreat back toward the mine's entrance, but it felt like they were letting us go, driving us back into the forest where they could have the advantage. My hands were shaking as I reloaded my rifle, Max limping slightly but still ready to fight at my side. Pete's arm was wrapped in a torn piece of his shirt, blood staining the fabric. "What the hell are these things?" Sam asked, his voice raw with fear. "They're not wolves. They're not. They're not anything." I cut him off. "Not anything we know. Just keep moving." We didn't get far before the howl started again, low and haunting, echoing through the trees like a song of death. It wasn't just one or two, it was dozens. The pack. They were toying with us now, letting us know we were in their territory. "We're not gonna make it," Pete said, his voice cracking. "There's too many." "Shut up," I snapped, my tone harsher than I intended. "We'll make it. We just have to stick together." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. It was full dark by the time we reached the edge of the forest. the fire tower barely visible in the distance. The pack stayed just far enough behind, their eyes glowing in the shadows like tiny fires, their movements nearly silent, except for the occasional snap of a branch. When we reached the clearing around the tower, I felt a brief wave of relief. The floodlights I'd set up earlier were still there, their bulbs unbroken, and I knew they'd give us at least some kind of advantage. If what Liam's journal said was true, the creatures couldn't handle certain kinds of light. "Get to the tower," I shouted, pushing Pete forward. "Go now." We ran as fast as we could, Max leading the way, his bark sharp and urgent. The creatures didn't stay in the shadows this time. They burst into the clearing, their bodies moving like blurs, barely visible in the dim light of the moon. I turned and fired, the shots slowing them down just enough for us to reach the base of the tower. "Climb!" I yelled, covering Pete and Sam as they scrambled up the metal ladder. Max was already halfway up, somehow managing to climb with quick, desperate movements. I fired again, hitting one of the creatures square in the chest, but it barely flinched. They were getting bolder, hungrier. As I climbed the ladder, one of them lunged, its claws raking against the metal just inches from my foot. I swung my rifle down, hitting it hard across the snout, and it let out a frustrated snarl, retreating for only a moment before trying again. By the time I reached the platform, I was breathless and shaking, but there was no time to rest. The creatures were circling below, their glowing eyes fixed on us, their growls vibrating through the air like a storm waiting to break. "We have to use the lights," I said, rushing to the power box. "It's our only chance." "Lights won't stop them," Sam said, his voice trembling. "They will," I said, flipping the switch. The floodlights roared to life, flooding the clearing with harsh, white light. The pack shrieked, their cries piercing and furious as they scrambled back into the shadows, their bodies twisting unnaturally to avoid the light. For the first time that night, I felt a small flicker of hope. "They can't stand it?" I said quietly, watching as the creatures retreated into the safety of the tree line. The light, it's their weakness. But the flicker of hope didn't last long. One of the creatures stepped forward taller, broader than the others, its glowing eyes burning brighter than any of them. It didn't flinch as the light hit it. It didn't retreat. It just stared up at us, its lips curling into something that might have been a grin if it wasn't so utterly horrifying. The Alpha. And when it spoke, its voice low and guttural, like stones scraping together, it was the last thing I ever expected. "Run," it said, the word clear and deliberate. "We like it when you run." The Alpha didn't move. It just stood there in the clearing, taller and more terrifying than the others, staring up at the tower like it knew we had nowhere else to go. Its glowing amber eyes burned with a flicker of red, and that grin stayed on its face, sending chills down my spine. None of us spoke for a moment. The silence stretched out, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint growls of the pack hidden in the darkness beyond the floodlights. I could feel the others behind me, frozen, just as terrified as I was. Even Max, usually fearless, pressed himself against my leg, his ears flat and his body shaking. "You heard that right?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling. It spoke." "I heard it," I said quietly, my eyes locked on the Alpha. "Stay calm. Don't panic." "How do we fight something like that?" Pete asked, his voice cracking. I gripped my rifle tighter, my mind racing. The pack wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. Strong, fast, smart, but the light had worked. It had forced them back. The journal had mentioned something else, too. Something about ancient weapons. My brother had written that the creatures couldn't be killed easily, but silver could hurt them. If Liam was right, then we had a chance, but I didn't have time to explain. "Pete, grab the ammo box from the corner," I said, my voice firm. "Sam, make sure the floodlights stay on. If anything happens to the power, we're done." "What about you?" Sam asked, his eyes wide. "I'll figure it out," I said, pulling Liam's journal out of my backpack. I flipped through the pages, searching for the part I'd read 100 times before, but never truly believed. The pack wasn't waiting anymore. They started testing the light, darting just at the edges of the clearing. One of them snarled and lunged forward, his body twisting back into the shadows just before the light burned his skin. They were trying to push us, trying to break through the barrier. The Alpha didn't move. It just watched, its head tilting slightly, like it was studying us. Then, slowly, it lifted one clawed hand and pointed straight at me. "You?" The voice was guttural, inhuman, but clear. My chest tightened. It wasn't just speaking, it was singling me out. "What do you want from me?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. It didn't answer right away. Instead, it took a step forward, into the edge of the light. The brightness didn't burn it like the others. If anything, it seemed to enjoy it, like it was proving it was stronger than the rest of the pack. "You belong with us," it growled, its lips pulling back to reveal rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. "Blood calls to blood." I froze. For a moment, those words didn't make sense. But then I remembered Liam, how he disappeared, how they'd never found his body. The journal had been his last message to me, but I'd always believed he was out there somewhere. "What did you do to him?" I asked, my voice sharper now. "What did you do to my brother?" The Alpha grinned wider, and for the first time, it stepped fully into the light, its massive body glowing eerily under the floodlights. "He's ours now," it said, almost mockingly. "And so will you be." Before I could respond, the Alpha let out a deafening roar, and the pack attacked as one. They charged into the clearing, slamming against the base of the fire tower, their claws tearing at the metal supports. The entire tower shook, and Pete screamed as one of the creatures leapt halfway up the ladder. "Shoot it!" I shouted, raising my rifle and firing. The creature snarled as the bullet hit its shoulder, but it didn't fall. Pete fired next, his aim wild but effective, and the creature let go, crashing to the ground below. "They're bringing it down," Sam yelled, gripping the floodlight controls like his life depended on it. The tower swayed violently as more of the pack slammed into it, their howls echoing in the night. I knew we couldn't hold out much longer. Then I saw it off to the side of the platform, tucked under a tarp. My backup plan. "Silver rounds," I said to myself, ripping the tarp off the small wooden crate. Liam had left them behind. He must have known I'd need them one day. Inside the box were a few handmade bullets, dull but deadly. I loaded them into my rifle with shaking hands. "You're going to stay with me, Max," I whispered, patting his head. "We're not done yet." The Alpha was still below, watching, waiting. It wasn't attacking like the other sit, was too smart for that. I knew it was waiting for me to run out of options, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But I wasn't going to give it the chance. I lined up my shot, the silver bullet glinting in the chamber. This was it. One shot. If I missed, I wasn't sure I'd get another chance. The Alpha looked up at me, and for a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in its eye, something human. But then, it snarled, and the moment was gone. I pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, and everything seemed to stop. The Alpha roared, stumbling backward as the bullet hit its chest, smoke rising from the wound. The pack froze, their howls turning into shrieks as the Alpha collapsed, its massive body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The remaining creatures scattered, retreating into the shadows without their leader. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. We didn't move for what felt like hours, but eventually, Pete broke the silence. Did we win?" I didn't answer. Instead, I climbed down the ladder, Max right behind me, and approached the Alpha's body. Its chest was still rising and falling, barely. Up close, the thing didn't look invincible anymore. It looked broken. "You could have been one of us," it rasped, its voice weak now. "You still can be." I shook my head. Not a chance. Then, with one final shot, it was over. Back at the tower, the others were waiting. Sam looked up at me as I climbed back onto the platform, his face pale but filled with relief. "Is it done?" he asked. "For now," I said, but deep down I knew it wasn't over. The Alpha might have been dead, But who knew how many more packs were out there? How many forests were still hiding these things? "I'll make sure it doesn't come back," I added quietly, more to myself than anyone else. Max wagged his tail weakly, nudging my hand as if to remind me I wasn't alone. We survived the night, but the shadows of Shadow Creek Valley were far from gone. By the time dawn broke over Shadow Creek Valley, the forest felt different. Still eerie, still quiet, but not the same kind of threatening silence as before. It was the kind of silence that comes after something terrible has ended, when the dust starts to settle. I sat on the edge of the fire tower platform, rifle across my lap, staring out at the horizon. My arms ached from holding it for so long, and my mind felt like it had been stretched too far, like it would never quite snap back into place again. Max was at my feet, resting his head on my boot, his tail twitching every so often in his sleep. He was exhausted, and so was I. The others were inside, trying to patch up Pete's arm. He hadn't said much since the attack, and I couldn't blame him. None of us really had the words to explain what had happened. How do you describe something no one's supposed to believe in? The Alpha was gone. I'd seen it fall, watched the life drain out of its monstrous body. I'd seen the rest of the pack scatter into the woods like cockroaches fleeing the light, and I'd felt a small flicker of relief, knowing we had lived through something we had no right surviving. But we weren't safe. Not really. Not yet. Later that morning, we climbed down from the tower. It felt risky at first, like the shadows might spring to life again. But nothing came for us. The forest was still lifeless. Even the birds and insects hadn't returned yet. It was as if the valley was holding its breath, waiting for something, maybe waiting to see if the pack would come back. Max stayed close to me as we made our way back to the mine. I didn't want to go there again, but we had to make sure. We had to know for certain that it was over. When we reached the entrance, I felt that same chill I'd felt the first time, like the mine itself was alive, filled with something dark and ancient. But this time, it was empty. The den inside was still littered with bones and shredded remains, but the creatures were gone. At the center of the cavern, where we'd found the Alpha's body, there was nothing left but a blackened stain on the rock. Its body had crumbled into ash, like it hadn't belonged to this world in the first place. And maybe it didn't. We didn't talk much on the hike back to the station. Pete, Sam, and I all knew what we'd seen, but none of us could quite wrap our heads around it. What were those things? How had they gotten here? And more importantly, were there more of them out there? I had a feeling I already knew the answer. I clenched Liam's journal in my hand as we walked, flipping through the pages for the 100th time. His words echoed in my head. Underscore. The pack isn't just one. It's many. They move through the shadows like a disease, spreading wherever the light doesn't reach. Underscore. Liam hadn't been talking about Shadow Creek Valley alone. He'd been talking about something bigger, something that wasn't confined to just one forest or one place. Killing the Alpha might have stopped this pack, but it was clear the threat wasn't over. Not by a long shot. When we got back to the station, we packed up our things and headed out. The government would be on its way soon. Sam had finally gotten through on the radio the night before, calling for backup. He didn't tell them the full truth, though. He just said there'd been a bear attack, that people were hurt. That's the kind of story people believe. I could already picture what would happen. They'd come in, sweep the area, maybe lock it down for a few weeks. They'd pat us on the back, tell us everything was fine now, and then leave without asking too many questions. That's how these things always go. But I knew the truth. I'd seen it with my own eyes, and I wasn't about to let it happen again. That night, back at the fire tower, I buried Max's old harness near the edge of the clearing. He wasn't gone, he was with me, sitting right next to me as I worked, but it felt like something had changed in him after the fight. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was something more, something stronger. "Don't worry, boy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "We're not done yet." I spent the next few hours making preparations. I gathered supplies, wrote notes, checked and double-checked my gear. And then I opened Liam's journal again, this time flipping to the back where he'd scribbled a map of the surrounding forests. He'd marked places where he thought other dens might be hidden. It was just a guess, but it was a start. The government closed off Shadow Creek Valley the following week, marking it as a restricted wildlife area. They put up signs, set up patrols, and made sure no one else would go wandering into the woods. But that didn't stop the whispers. People in the nearby town started talking about strange sightings again, movements in the dark, howls echoing through the mountains. The pack wasn't gone. Not really. And so, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for them to find me. I was going to hunt them first. I started tracking them that very night, taking Max with me as my partner. I reached out to a few people I could trust, survivalists, hunters, folks who knew how to fight and together. We started putting the pieces together. We weren't just rangers or hikers anymore. We were something else. Monster hunters. The thing about creatures like this, about things that move through shadows and silences, that they thrive on fear. They feed on it. But I'm not afraid anymore. Not after everything I've seen. Not after everything I've survived. I know what's out there now, and I know how to stop it. My name is Catherine Kit Winters. I'm the last line of defense between them and the rest of the world. And I'm just getting started.